afternoon, one and all. The Staff Academy of LS Raheja College welcomes all of you for the first session of our academic year 21-22. We have with us Dr. Preeti Vaswani, who is the spokesperson for the day today. Preeti is an assistant professor in English, teaching business communication at FI BCom and communication skills at FI BA. And her specialization includes English language and literature, American literature, and existentialism. She's been in the teaching profession for the last 19 years, and her interests include communication, public speaking, creative writing, teaching, and reading. She has also published a book of poems, as well as she has published her PhD thesis. Her work is on existentialism, and today she's amongst us to speak about existential philosophy and humanism. We welcome you, Preeti, and without wasting much time, I request you to please start with your session.
Thank you, Samya. Thank you for giving me this chance to speak about this topic, and also for that grand welcome. Thanks a lot. I'd like to, yes, I have it here. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, Preeti, visible.
Yeah. Okay. So here we are to know about existential philosophy and humanism. To begin with, this is not new for any one of us. It's not new for anyone because we are all existence and we are all humans. So this is something which we are, but we are only going to make ourselves a little more aware of it right now. So I've not given you here any technical definitions of existentialism, but I've just kept it plain and simple, that existentialism is an exploration and understanding of the human situation. Existentialist thinkers frequently explore issues related to the meaning of existence, purpose and value of human existence. Therefore, existentialism is of all-time relevance. It never decays, it never becomes irrelevant, because human existentialism is always there as long as humans are there on this earth. So coming to the meaning of existentialism, it comes from the word existence, and existence comes from the word exist. Exist is to be in the world. If you look at it etymologically, the word exist comes from ex plus sist. From Latin, it comes from ex sistere. And in Latin, the word ex sistere means to stand out or emerge from the background. That means human as an individual against everything else in creation. So that is standing out or emerging from the background as a separate entity. And the root sense of existence is standing out from the rest of everything that is there. Now, let's ponder a little bit about the nature of existence. We all know that we are beings in the world, but at the same time, we are beings with others in the world. Now, how is this different? I am an individual, but I am not just an individual. I am also a part of a crowd. Part of a crowd as in part of my social groups, part of my work groups, part of family groups, relationships groups. So we belong to different groups, and we belong to humanity in general as well. So we are whole and part at the same time. And this lays a platform or a ground for a state of tension in our existence. Why is it? Because when I am an individual, I cease to be a part because I am exhibiting individualistic characteristics and nature. But when I am a part of a crowd or of a group, then I give in, I submit to the group, I lose my selfhood, my individualism to a certain extent in order to belong and to get the sense of belongingness. And this is important. So it's just like they are inversely proportional to each other. As much individualistic I am, that much I am not a part of the crowd. As much as I am a part of the crowd, that much I lose my individualistic nature. Now, this is the nature of existence, and this is the platform that creates a tension in the very format of existence. Man identifies and understands himself through the other. Now here other is with the capital O. So other is everything apart from the person, the individual person. Everything else is the other. So man identifies and understands himself through the other, which is an obligatory part of his existence. So it's important. Why are we all here together living on this planet at the same time? It's important for each other's growth and development, not because we may be interdependent on each other. That of course is a part of it, a reason for it, but also because the other helps the individual to understand himself and understand the other at the same time. Now let me explain this. I can know myself in comparison with the other. I can know myself in the context of the other. I can know myself in the perception of the other. So the other is important for my own understanding of myself. And when I understand myself, I am equally at the same time even understanding other. So other is not bad, other is not good, other is necessary, other is important. Without the other, man loses his selfhood, and therefore the self and the other coexist with each other. This is the basic principle of existential philosophy. And here comes the paradox of human existence. I just mentioned a while back about the paradox. The paradox of human existence is that the world that enables an individual to exist also tends to diminish his selfhood or take it away from him, thus turning him into an object or a part of the crowd. So we need to give away our individualism to a certain extent in order to belong to a larger group. This is the paradox. You got to exist individually as well as a part. Otherwise, there is alienation. If I choose myself as an individual, I alienate myself from the crowd. If I choose the crowd, I alienate myself from my own deepest being. In one way or the other, alienation is experienced, alienation or estrangement from the self. This always is there as an obligatory part of human existence. Freedom and responsibility is one important aspect of human existence. They go together. Where there is freedom, there is responsibility. There has to be responsibility. They never are two separate things. So if a person chooses himself or takes actions on his own, he is completely responsible for his actions. But say, for example, he doesn't want to take action. Then he goes with the crowd. He does what everybody else does. He does what the crowd chooses for him. So either we give in and say, all right, everybody thinks this way, so I'm going to do this way because I don't want to get into the state of responsibility of choosing for myself and also being responsible for the consequences of my actions. So let me give in myself. So that is one way of living. Another way of living is I assume responsibility. No matter what my actions are, I'll be solely responsible for them. So freedom, when I use my freedom, I get into a state of responsibility. When I give away my freedom, I also leave the sense or free myself from the state of responsibility. So who is taking away my freedom? I submit my freedom to the other so that other or the group or the society or the crowd, they disburden me of my responsibility so that I don't suffer anxiety. There is anxiety in freedom. Sorry. So in this case, he may not suffer anxiety, but eventually he loses his selfhood and becomes an object in the world or a part of a crowd and suffers inauthentic existence. Inauthentic as in not true, not of great value, not of great meaning. It's like just being there. But for example, if a person chooses and uses the freedom and assumes responsibility, then he's actually taking a leap. By making a choice, one is taking a leap. And what's this leap? Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish existential philosopher, who is considered as the father of existential philosophy, he calls the leap as a feeling wherein a person is in between two states of being. So I am at a particular state of being now. I'm comfortable. I'm not making any choice. I am all that is there and is settled down within me. But now I want to make a new choice, maybe something that I have never made before. And that is my aim of reaching to another state of being. And this shift between one state of being and another state of being leaves me with a feeling of being in mid-air. Mid-air, no groundedness, because I am no longer what I was. I am no longer what I am going to be. I am somewhere in between. I am in a process. I am in a making. I am in a leap. I am in mid-air. And this leap is what causes anxiety. This is what Kierkegaard calls a leap beyond the immediate situation, so that we have committed ourselves for circumstances that have not yet become clear. That's why responsibility is important, because we don't know the result or consequences. Whether our action was right or wrong is going to be judged by the people only by the result. The same action, if it gets good result, is going to be said, yeah, well done. That was a good choice. And if that turns out to be messy, and oh, that was a really bad choice. So the crowd judges by the result, but at the time of making a choice, at the time of making a decision, we don't know the consequences. So it is a state of uncertainty of being, and this is what also leads to anxiety. Talking more about anxiety, Paul Tillich, who is a German existential philosopher who later moved on to America, he talks about 3 forms of anxiety. He says that humans suffer the anxiety of fate and death, which he calls ontic anxiety. The anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness of our being, life, existence, whatever. All that is, he terms spiritual anxiety. And the anxiety of guilt and condemnation. So if my action doesn't lead to positive results, I'm going to be guilty of having made a bad choice, of things like that, and condemn. So the anxiety of guilt and condemnation is what he calls moral anxiety, and the result of all these 3 anxieties is despair. But that doesn't mean that existentialism is a pessimistic philosophy that only focuses on the despair and the hopelessness and the meaninglessness of being. No, that's not the case. Though there are many readers who have accused existentialism of being a really pessimistic philosophy, which actually it is not. And we'll come to that a little in just a while. Here we have Martin Heidegger, who is also a German existential philosopher, and let's see what he's got to say about this. He says, when someone is born, he does not find himself in the beginning of the world. Of course, we are born into a culture, we are born into a course of history, we are born into a set of possibilities, we are born into a world which has already been created by the people living in it, by the people who have lived on this earth. So we are born somewhere in the middle of history, somewhere in a particular culture, at a particular geographical location that has its own set of beliefs and ideas. And at birth, of course, the existent cannot take hold of himself, because there's something that he is put into, and this putting into some set of possibilities, putting into a particular setting, is where we find ourselves, and we fall onto those set of possibilities. Why do we fall? We don't decide. Our parents decide for us, society decides, our teachers decide, everybody around us decides, because we are dependent. And so we have fallen onto a set of possibilities that have been set by others for us. But then we assume responsibility. We get to realize that our capabilities increase as we grow, and if we still allow ourselves to be in the state of falling, in the state of as you can say, in a state of putting yourself, how do I put it, in a automated mode. Okay, putting yourself in the automated mode. So somebody drove the keys for me and put in a particular program. So I have social conditioning, I have parental conditioning, I have educational conditioning and cultural conditioning. All these conditionings are there, and if I allow myself to be in the automated mode and just move on autopilot, then I am still in a state of falling. But then if I evaluate these things and I choose, this is what I want to stick on to, and I unchoose, this is what I want to step out of, then I'm assuming responsibility for myself, and that is taking hold. So Martin Heidegger characterizes the state of falling onto and taking hold. What we fall onto is a set of ideas that others already have ready for us about what we should be, who we are. So you all have to be born, you are going to go to school at the age of 3, you are all going to do your education till the 12th standard. After that, you're going to get a degree, and then you go on for a post-graduation, or you get into a job and you get a good job. You have to get good salary. You've got to be rich. You've got to make money. You've got to marry. You've got to have a family. You've got to have children, give them really good upbringing, and then see them grow, be happy, and die. I mean, who sets all this? This is already set. Now, whether we choose to do all this or we unchoose it is what we do to express our individualism. What we fall onto is a set of ideas that others already have ready for us about what we should be and who we are. This falling is not avoidable. We can't, negate this state of being from the beginning. It is where we start out from. But authenticity for Dasein is a German word which means being there. So you can just talk about Dasein as an individual. But the authenticity for Dasein at some point has to take hold of its own possibilities of being and make them his own. So even if I am following the rules of a particular culture, I believe in them. I'm convinced that yes, even if my culture or if my religion or if my education or if the society does not advocate these rules, I still want to follow this because I believe in it and I feel that this is my choice. So rather than just making do with possibilities that are handed on to Dasein. This is what is falling versus taking hold. When Dasein confronts its own possibilities as a self-projecting entity, it experiences anxiety. Yes, when I make a choice, I in the sense anyone, of course, for that matter, they experience anxiety. And this anxiety is very disturbing. It's because you are isolated from the crowd. The crowd is not deciding. Human is deciding. The individual is deciding. And so the individual feels alone. We've already talked of alienation, self-alienation, and alienation from the they, from the other. So somewhere or the other, alienation has to come about. Anxiety has to come about. And now, if the person overcomes this anxiety and still stands as an individual, then he lives authentically. Sometimes this anxiety is too difficult to bear. It's like really, really unhandleable. I mean, not able to be handled. And so they flee back to the world. Oh my God, no more individualism. Come on, no more of this anxiety. Let me get back and do what the thousands of people are doing. And then they lose the self, which is fine. Which is fine because it sometimes takes time. Until and unless boredom sets in, until and unless there's this thought, oh my God, what's the meaning? I'm just running, I'm a part of the crowd. Until and unless that sets in. If things are fine, it's okay. He finds in anxiety the possibility of a disclosure that is quite distinctive. So in this anxiety, he says, oh, how different I am from the others. This is my individualistic state of being. This is my identity. This is who I truly am. So this anxiety is not bad. It's good. It's actually good, because anxiety makes the individual looks at individuality in the face. And this individualization brings the individual back from falling to the authentic state of being as far as the individual can handle it. So this is like a seesaw, up and down, self and other, anxiety and comfort, as much as we can. All these are experiences. All is fine and all are beautiful. In order to escape anxiety, man fits himself to socially constructed patterns of existence, but in the event forgoes his human existence, and we know that we've already discussed. According to Heidegger, anxiety offers man a disclosure of the human condition. So it brings before you a new level of understanding, this anxiety. It jerks a person out of his pseudo security. So even if I feel secure in the crowd, but it's a false security, I still have to, come out of that false sense of security and face this uncanniness. And that is what drives a person to try out actions that make clear to him, hey, I am an authentic existing individual. So the only scope left for man is to realize the absurdity of life, accept it. It's inescapable. Either I make a choice or don't make a choice, I'm still choosing. So not choosing is not an option. A person has to choose. So if a person is not choosing, he's just like, do whatever you want, let it, whatever wants to happen, happen. I'm not going to take action. I'm just going to be there because I don't want this anxiety. It's okay if it is inauthentic, I don't care. This existence is fine with me. Still, he's choosing passive tolerance. And he's still going to be equally responsible for whatever is happening in the world. Because either we are actively involved in a situation or we are passively tolerant to a situation. The responsibility still is there. So, the only scope left to man is to realize the absurdity of life, accept it as inescapable, and strive towards authenticity. This is what Sartre calls we need to do, and he terms it as good faith. Then we are people living in good faith. David Bannock, he is another writer on existential authors, existential thinkers, and he explains the despair and rebellion we feel at the loss of our external sources of value are the necessary price of a greater value and happiness that comes from within. And so what happens to the individual who lives authentically? He finds greater value in life. He finds greater value in existence. He doesn't find happiness outside. He doesn't have to depend on others for happiness. Oh, if somebody does this good to me, I am going to be happy. If these circumstances turn out to be so favorable and pleasing and comforting, then I'm going to be happy. All this is external dependence. But a person who lives authentically finds value and happiness within the self, and that is why Sartre says authentic way of living has a greater value, a greater happiness that comes from within, and he says that this is the key to understanding the existential concept of happiness. So then what to do? Do we reject the crowd? Do we just live alone? Do we just go onto the mountains and live a life of isolation because isolation is anyway going to be there? I mean, no, both are important and we've got to deal with both. So we've got to evolve as a society. We've got to evolve as humanity. How do we evolve? By let's read it. Existence with others is to be judged authentic to the degree that it lets individuals be free to become the unique persons that they are. Can the crowd allow me to be a part of the crowd as well as be the unique being that I am? That is an ideal state of existence. That is true community. That is highly evolved community. It is the community that allows for true diversity. How many times do we pass judgment on others? Oh, these sort of ways of living, live-in relationships, gay marriages, people have simply corrupted the society. So many judgments are passed by by people of conservative thinking. So these judgments do not allow diversity, do not allow freedom. So as much as we restrict the freedom of the individual, we are restricting our own freedom within the group. So thus existentialism analyzes the human condition and drives one towards living authentically. Evolution. Why are we even talking about existentialism? Why did it evolve? Why did we even have to think about the individual and the crowd and the other, and why all this? This is because of two reasons. Existentialism evolved as a result of the Industrial Revolution that stripped man of his subjectivity and rendered him an object among other machines. So after 1850, I think 1860 onwards, I think that was the time of the Industrial Revolution, if I'm not wrong. There was a lot of economic development because of industrialization. But then there was also a lot of inhuman behavior, very harsh working conditions, and people treated like machines with 12 hours of work, 16 hours of work, children 18 hours of work. So inhuman, no medical leaves, nothing, and living in very, very inhuman conditions. So that was one sort of very bad labor conditions that were there during the time of the Industrial Revolution. And then there were two world wars in 1914 to 18, First World War, 1939 to 45, Second World War. And these world wars also, like there were like innumerable people dying, and it was so devastating. Values had dropped. Like the troop commander would simply send out a whole army just to be killed. Does that make sense? I mean, war to begin with doesn't make sense, because now that's a different area to discuss. Let's talk about the devastation of war, the collapse of values. There was a prevalence of injustice, the rise of totalitarian systems. So this is a government that does not allow individual freedom. So there was a lot of dehumanization energy during that time, and to revolt that, existentialism had to come about. It provoked man to quest for meaning in an inhuman world. And there were also more systems like the Hegelism and evolutionism, things like that, that denied individual subjectivism. And in order to bring about a balance in the state of being of humanity, existentialism was born. Actually, it wasn't born at that time, I should say. It gained more prominence because existentialism is there even in the writings of Augustine that that found its place around 350 AD or so. So it's a very old way of thinking, but gained a lot of prominence after the two world wars and the Industrial Revolution. Jean-Paul Sartre, he is a very famous French existential philosopher, and he is my favorite existential philosopher. And his writings examine man as a responsible but lonely being, burdened with a terrifying freedom to choose. Now, if freedom is such a beautiful thing, why does Sartre call it as a terrifying thing? We'll just come to know. And set adrift in a meaningless universe. So man is at first nothing, because he is in a state of falling onto possibilities. Then he later becomes something because he takes hold of himself and he assumes responsibility. Now, this is what Sartre calls subjectivity, and he says this is the first principle of existentialism. Now, man is condemned to be free, says Sartre. Why is it? We are condemned because it's not just the anxiety of the consequences of our actions, but it is deeper, it is greater, it is larger, it is unimaginably larger. Why is that so? Sartre extends man's self-responsibility to universal responsibility because every choice of his involves a creation of a certain image of man. Now, this is a sentence with heavyweight meaning. In making a choice, the person is not choosing just for himself or herself, but is shifting the image of the entire human mankind with his action, is setting an example for others to follow. So, if the consequences of the actions are going to be negative, then the responsibility is multifold. That's anguish. That's too heavy to bear. So Sartre says, even if you don't want to be free, you don't have the freedom not to be free. You have to choose. As a result, man suffers anguish, which is his feeling of total and deep responsibility for mankind. So today, if we are here in the coronavirus situation, it is not just because a handful of scientists made some experiment in a Chinese Wuhan lab, and it is because of them that the whole world is suffering. No, there may have been certain things of which the entire human mankind has been passively tolerant about, has never taken any action, has never raised voice against certain things. Like people never raised voice against deforestation, against the tearing of the ozone layer, until and unless it became really scary, until and unless the situation was so prominently dangerous. So even passive tolerance, in passive tolerance, we assume responsibility. So everything that happens, some way or the other, we are affected by it because we are at some unknown level, at some unseen level, at some indirect level, responsible for it. Sartre gives the example of a military officer's anguish, whose decision involves the lives and death of a number of people in the troop. So his one action is going to lead people to death. He has to do it. The war has to be fought. But imagine his situation. If he is a responsible being with a conscience, he's going to blame himself for that. I mean, it's a very tricky way. It's a very tricky thing to understand. Sartre strikingly describes man as condemned to be free, condemned because he did not create himself, but yet he is free because he is responsible for everything. So, a person does not have the freedom not to be free. The person has to face freedom, and he calls this terrifying. But then it's also positive because everything is in our hands. Sartre claims that there can be no doctrine more optimistic than existentialism because man's destiny is within himself. I can create. With this freedom, I can create the world I want to be in. Isn't that the best possible start? So Sartre says that's why it's very optimistic. Because if there are certain things that need to be corrected, we have the power to do them with the same freedom that he calls really terrifying. So Sartre professes that subjectivity cannot be strictly individual is because man discovers himself through the cognito in the presence of others and perceives them as the condition of his existence. So this is a repeated point about what Sartre had already said in one of my previous slides. And I'm going to just read this, which is just an extension of what I spoke about. The other here has to be with a capital O because it means not the other man, not the other woman, but the entire entities of existence that is not me. The other is indispensable to my own existence as well as to my own knowledge about myself. This being so, in discovering my inner being, I discover the other person at the same time. So this growth, this knowledge, this awareness, this consciousness is inward and outward at the same time. It's like moving and growing in both directions. Sartre calls this intersubjectivity, because the freedom of one person is connected with the freedom of others. One is obliged to want others to have freedom at the same time that he or she wants his own. So it's not just like only one person has freedom, come on, all of you now, no freedom at all. No, this person also gets into bonds, or also gets into a state of being bound. So it has to coexist at the individual level as well as at the level of the crowd. In the end, authentic existence is what matters. And this existentialism has created a great development in psychotherapy. In the medical field, existential psychotherapy brings about an understanding and healing of personality through through analyzing human will and intentionality rather than making an analysis of the unconscious processes. So instead of looking at a person like what he feels at the unconscious level, what he feels at the subconscious level, and then offer treatment, we need to ask the person, what was your intention at doing that? What was the will? What was the desire? Why did you want to do that? Because we don't understand man in general as, you know, a slave to the unconscious and a slave to one's thoughts, but having the power of free will. So if something has happened, it's not totally because of some unconscious patterns in your mind, it's also because you wanted to do it. And so you know, analyzing human will and intentionality, what was the intention, that helps gain a clearer understanding of the subject at hand. And prominent analysts of existential psychoanalysts are Ludwig Binswanger and Medard Boss. Though their methods of treating patients do not considerably differ from Freud's therapeutic technique, they claim that an existential analysis brings about a fuller understanding of the patient. This is important, like understanding him 360 degrees than Freud's own theory, thus resulting in a more efficacious treatment of patients. So this has helped not just at the general level, but also at the level of medical profession. It's timeless. Existentialism is timeless. Even after the World War ended, even after the Industrial Revolution ended, even after things have become better, the value of existential ways of thinking and being do not diminish. It might be asserted that existentialism is a timeless sensibility. That's why I thought it would be relevant for you, and I offered to speak on this topic. It is not so much a set of doctrines. This is not rules, or you need to follow rules. It's like, it's an attitude. It's a reaction. Even though it came to limelight after the Second World War and, you know, social incidents, but it's always there, it was always there, and it always will be. And that was all about existentialism, but I thought I want to give you a feel of it, like, you know, a practical feel of what all I spoke. So I chose the short story by Sartre, and it's like totally mind-blowing. I'm not going to read the entire short story for you. It runs up to 15 pages, but I'll tell it to you. And I have also taken excerpts or passages from the story, because I thought just picking up those chunks that I really felt very, you know, very authentic, needs to come before you, so you can feel what it means. So this story, The Wall, is set against and it's just going to take a few more minutes. But now get into the mode of the feeling, okay, of the story. This is set against the Spanish Civil War, and they used to just pick prisoners and pronounce death sentences on them, and this was done by the nationalists, the Nationalist Party, and death for no reason, okay. It's just like no reason given to them, no court trial, nothing, simply sentenced to death. So this is the background. And there are three prisoners, Tom, Pablo Ibieta, and Juan. The title refers to the wall. Why is it titled The Wall? Because the prisoners are made to face the wall, and they are shot. They are shot and killed. And so the wall itself symbolizes the inevitability and unknowing of one's death. So you can't see death, but you know it's coming. The protagonist or the main character of the story is Pablo Ibieta. He is put in a cell or in a room, a cell with two other people, Tom and Juan, and it's pronounced to them, hey, all the three of you, tomorrow morning, you all three are going to be executed. And they spend sleepless night, lots of anxiety, anguish, fear, trembling. They send a doctor in and say, and this is the procedure, okay, just routine procedure. The doctor is there in the cell all night to see to it that he is available for the three dying people, okay. So suddenly Yuan spoke. You're a doctor? Yes, the Belgian said. Does it hurt very long? Huh? When? Oh no, the Belgian said paternally. Not at all. It's over quickly. They're talking about the execution, okay? It's over quickly. He acted as though he were calming a cash customer. But they told me sometimes they have to fire twice. Sometimes, the Belgian said, nodding. It may happen that the first volley reaches no vital organs. Then they have to reload their rifles and aim all over again. He thought for a moment and then added hoarsely, that takes time. He had a terrible fear of suffering. It was all he thought about. It was his age. I never thought much about it. And it was fear of suffering that made me sweat. Actually, it's an icy cold night, but these three prisoners are sweating. They are dying while alive. The Belgian didn't seem to be listening. So, you know, Tom or you and one of them, they asked the doctor, how is it exactly done? Please tell me now so that I can be mentally prepared. Do they shoot right while looking at us? Do they make us turn towards the wall? Like, how does it happen? But the Belgian doesn't answer. The Belgian is the doctor, okay? He doesn't seem to be listening. I knew what he had come to do. He wasn't interested in what we thought. He came to watch our bodies dying in agony while yet alive. So the reactions of the body in the face of death. That man, doctor, has a tomorrow to think of. These three prisoners have no tomorrow to think of because tomorrow is only ceasing to exist. All three of us watched him because he was alive. He had the motions of a living human being, the cares of a living human being. He shivered in the cellar the way the living are supposed to shiver. He had an obedient, well-fed body. The rest of us hardly felt ours. Not in the same way anyhow. I watched the Belgian, balancing on his legs, master of his muscles, someone who could think about tomorrow. There we were, three bloodless shadows. We watched him and we sucked his life like vampires. I remembered my whole life, how I was out of work for 3 months in 1926, how I almost starved to death. I remembered a night I spent on a bench in Granada. I hadn't eaten for 3 days. I was angry. I didn't want to die. That made me smile. How madly I ran after happiness, after women, after liberty. Why? I wanted to free Spain. I admired Pi Y Margall. I joined the anarchist movement. I spoke in public meetings. I took everything as seriously as if I were immortal. So while he was alive, he never imagined that he would die. And that brought about a disenchantment in his being. Disenchantment or disillusionment, like that. At that moment, I felt that I had my whole life in front of me. and I thought it was a damned lie. It was worth nothing because it was finished. I wondered how I'd been able to walk to laugh with the girls. I wouldn't have moved so much as my little finger if I had only imagined I would die like this. My life was in front of me, shut, closed like a bag, and yet everything inside of it was unfinished. For an instant, I tried to judge it. I wanted to tell myself, this is a beautiful life, but I couldn't pass judgment on it. It was only a sketch. I had spent my time counterfeiting eternity. I had understood nothing. Now I missed nothing. There were so many things I could have missed. The taste of manzanilla or the baths I took in summer in a little creek near Cadiz. But death had disenchanted everything. So then what they do is they offer him. They kill, of course, they kill Tom and Ewan, and they call this man, our protagonist, Pablo Ibita, and they tell him, see, if you are going to tell me where your leader is hiding, where Raymond Gris, the leader of your troop, is hiding, then we are going to set you free because we are more interested in killing Raymond than you. So they make an offer. He is offered a way out if he reveals the location of his comrade Raymond Gris. Now he thinks to himself, I don't care about my life. I don't care about the war, the freedom, for what all I have been fighting. And he simply refuses to cooperate. And then he questions his own self. Why am I not revealing the place of hiding of Raymond Gris when I know that he is hiding in his cousin's house just 4 kilometers out of the city? Why is it that I no longer care about my own life against his deaths, against his life, like he'll die instead of me? Why don't I want that? Because of the disenchantment that he has experienced in the whole night of waiting in the face of death. So he gives false information. He says, hey, come on. Now, when life has no meaning, let me joke a little. Let me play with it a little. And then, now just see the attitude. Okay, it's not a normal attitude because, you know, all trembling and shivering in the face of death that has gone. And now he says, let me joke a little with them. Now he's going from falling on to taking hold. The shift has happened. He says, yes, I know where Raymond Gris is. He's hiding in a cemetery in the city. Okay, in a tombstone, he's hiding there. And he just laughs. Come on. These people have, I mean, I'm going to find it funny if they're simply going to lift up tombstones, finding where is Raymond, where is Raymond? But Raymond is not going to be there. Raymond is in his cousin's house. And then they'll come back angry. Let them be angry. They'll come back. At least I fooled them. And then let them come and kill me. And then I looked at them with curiosity as insects of a very rare species. These are the military agents who are giving him this offer, okay? I told him, I know where he is. He is hidden in the cemetery, in a vault, or in the grave digger's shack. It was a farce. It was a lie, of course. I wanted to see them stand up, buckle their belts, and give orders busily. They jumped onto their feet. Let's go, moles. Go get 15 men from Lieutenant Lopez. You, the fat man said. I'll let you off if you're telling the truth, but it will cost you plenty if you're making monkeys out of us. They left in a great clatter, and I waited peacefully under the guard of the phalangistas. So these are the other soldiers, and he's laughing. Hey, come on. What a joke this life is, and what a joke I made of them. From time to time, I smiled, thinking about the spectacle they would make. I felt stunned and malicious. I imagined them lifting up tombstones, opening the doors of the vaults one by one. I represented the situation to myself as if I had been someone else. This prisoner obstinately playing the hero. These grim phalangistas. It's a political ideology, so followers of that ideology, with their mustaches and their men in uniform running among the graves. It was irresistibly funny. After half an hour, the little fat man came back alone. I thought he had come to give me the orders to execute me. The others must have stayed in the cemetery, but they didn't kill him. You know what? That man, Raymond Gris, He had left his cousin's home because he thought it was unsafe. Then he went to Pablo Ibita's home, and then he thought, oh my God, this is not a right place to hide because Pablo himself is caught. Let me go and hide myself in the grave, in the cemetery. And he goes and hides in the cemetery, the place where Ibita jokingly told the militants, jokingly told the military officers that he is hiding there. But he was actually hiding there. So Raymond Gris moved from his previous hiding place to the very spot where Pablo jokingly told the authorities he may be found. Thus Raymond Gris is shot, and Pablo's life is at least temporarily spared from deaths. Everything began to spin, and I found myself sitting on the ground. I laughed so hard, I cried. Banach says, if one could face one's deaths, face the impossibility of getting any value from any external accomplishments, and still find value within oneself. So even if I'm not able to achieve anything, still if I can value myself, that value would be invulnerable to the uncontrollable contingencies of the natural world. So talking about the story, to conclude in the words of Carl and Hemelian, the climax of an existential story is not a traditional climax at all, but simply a ripple of behavior, a sense of nausea overcome or experienced, a broken relationship recognized by both parties, a meaningless journey completed to nowhere. Nevertheless, existentialism is not just a cold analysis of the human condition, but is itself a passionate quest for authentic existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Preeti, for your session on existential philosophy and humanism. Since you spoke about Sartre, just I would like to add here that Sartre was also offered, I mean to say, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964, which he declined with the fear saying that it would limit his, capacity to write. So, a great philosopher and thinker was Sartre, though his ideas, many looked at it as being, full of despair. But nevertheless, we'll come to that. But thank you for this session. I now leave the session open for questions, if any, by our staff. Any questions, please raise your hand. I think Laila had one question which she had put up on the chat box. Let me just look at it. She's asking the question, freedom and responsibility in personal life and professional life, is it same or different?
All the same in any walk of life, in any sphere of life, they both go together. They have to go together. So whichever area of your life, even if it is relationships, personal life, professional life, everywhere, they have to go together. That is the law of nature.
Yeah, any other questions anybody has that they would like to ask before we put in the vote of thanks? Any more questions?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Ram, you're audible.
Yeah. So, ma'am, one personal question to Preeti madam, that is, so ma'am, what made you to do research on this topic, on existentialism? There would have been many topics, so why only this topic? What attracted you? So, there would have been many topics for research or PhD, so why this topic only? Why not anything else?
I was trying to find meaning in my own life, Ram. It was a personal quest that attracted me to this topic. It was my own personal quest at that point of time that brought this before me, and I just kept flowing into it because it made a lot of meaning. It made a lot of sense to me. I wasn't as individualistic earlier in my life. I would call myself as majorly a part of the crowd in the first half of my life, and it was later that existentialist thoughts and ideas made a lot of meaning and sense to me. And I really felt the kick of individualism, and I like it. Thank you for asking me this question.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, Preeti, since you mentioned this, let me ask you also this one question. See, when you talk about Sartre, Sartre's critics saw existentialism as, basically a philosophy that led to despair, pessimism, depressing ideas, because they looked at it as a philosophy of inaction, uh, which discouraged people from committing themselves to any course of action. Of course, Sartre did answer his critics also, but since you have spoken about and worked on Sartre, in Sartre's thinking, which tendencies do you see as depressing, and which ones do you find as being very inspiring?
Lovely question. It is a lovely question. Thank you. Actually, Sartre never said get into inaction or commitment. He actually advocated action. And secondly, what is it that is depressing in Sartre? And what was the second part of your question?
And which things do you or which ideas do you find are inspiring or
Inspiring? Yeah. So the depressing thing about it is an awakening. Hey man, no longer sleeping in the crowd. You've got to raise yourself. You've got to live an authentic existence. And that's very discomforting because, change brings about resistance from within. So people found it depressing. Oh, really? This is inauthentic. My God, I've got to take action. I've got to suffer anxiety. I've got to live authentically because there's no meaning. Actually, yes, but it's depressing because we can see anxiety coming, on the way down the road, and inspiring because whatever we have created, if it is not working out well, we can uncreate it, we can redo it. So everything is in our hands. That's very inspiring. But the sad part of it is it's not just the individual who evolves. It's the entire crowd that has to evolve together. Otherwise, the individual feels really, really alienated and cannot carry the crowd along because each and every one has to feel that sense of commitment, action, responsibility. Otherwise, Sartre's words will have no meaning. So he actually worked towards the evolution of humanity in general, the evolution of the crowd towards authentic existence. It's an individual who begins, but it's the crowd that also needs to realize it. At the individual level, if each one realizes, is a crowd that evolves. So that's difficult because it's not just in one person's hand, but it slowly but surely comes about, and human history has seen that growth.
Hello, Preeti ma'am, one more question.
Yeah.
So regarding the topic itself, would you like to comment on other schools of metaphysical philosophy of thoughts, that is idealism, realism, pragmatism, and others? So how it is different or similar to other schools of thought? What made it distinct from other?
The major distinct factor is they had a set of rules. Existentialism says find your own rules, create your own rules. In case you really want to call it rules, just do what you feel. That's what existentialism says, because it's more humanitarian. Rather than placing external authority, it says your authority, inner authority lies from within. Just explore it. This is the unique feature of existentialism. It's more humanitarian.
So in future, can we go beyond existentialism? What do you think? Because it seems that we are evolving from somewhere and we have reached up to existentialism through human evolution. If that is there like that. So what can be next step? Your projections.
So I would say
existentialism. Yes.
So existentialism doesn't give us a goal to reach and aim to achieve. It's not that. It's a balance. If you are satisfied being part of the crowd, very well, realize it, choose it and be it. If you are satisfied being an individual, if that makes more sense, choose that. So it is more of a balance of being rather than being drifting away in the flow of a current, or you know, harsh revolution that leads you to nowhere. So it's more of a balance. So it's not traveling from a point to a point. It is a balanced state of being. It's a realization and the awareness and consciousness of one state of being, taking hold, taking responsibility. This is all it advocates, and that never changes.
Okay, yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ram, for your questions. Any more questions? Any more questions from Preeti? So these novels, Albert Camus, The Outsider, Dostoevsky's novels, all this would fall under the existential
Crime and Punishment,
philosophy, right?
The
Crime and Punishment
Stranger,
philosophy.
The Stranger, The Outsider,
Yes.
Camus, all of them,
Double,
right?
Double, all of them would.
I've read all of them, all
Yeah.
of them. 10 years I read, 10 years.
Yeah, so have I. I've read these books I have read. So when you were talking about it, or you know, even when Sartre spoke about being and nothingness, again, you know, these are questions which one needs to really ponder upon, and you know, it makes us think about our actual being, our actual existence. So I think you've thrown light on these issues, and I'm sure that the staff has thoroughly enjoyed it and also learned a lot from it. A lot of other questions I'm sure must be coming into your mind. That is what we aim at, you know, pose yourself these questions, you know, try to understand the society from a wider perspective as well. So I now call upon Ram to convey the vote of thanks on behalf of the Staff Academy, LS Raheja College. Yes, Ram, over to you.
Yeah,
Ram,
thank you,
please
ma'am.
keep your camera on if possible.
Okay, just 1 minute. Actually, I'm in college and there is no light as such. It's room number F9, I hope. So let me see.
Yeah, if it is possible, Ram, and then we are also going to have a picture of
Okay, I
us.
don't know. Okay,
Yeah, thank you, Ram.
Okay. Uh, so on behalf of Staff Academy, I would like to thank Dr. Preeti Vaswani ma'am. So for choosing such a topic, though that is her PhD topic, but that is very relevant in today's situation. In decision making, being an individual, what should be our base to decide? And when any philosopher or philosophy comes in, we are all philosopher, but though we are not professionally trained for that, but somehow if someone among us is a philosopher, a big professional philosopher rather, so I mean just one line is enough to ignite us, to make us in that thinking. We may not read philosophies, but that individual society, that very first line itself ignited me. So that was enough for me. So that is the success of today's, I think, this webinar. And the way Preeti madam said, and the last, the story wala thing, I was very much excited. What is going to happen? And then when okay, so that was, I mean, very amazing to me. So yeah, and thank you all. And yeah, I mean, the content cannot be, it was not easy. It was philosophy, so it may take some time to absorb. And I'm thankful to Samya Sindhe madam also uh, for having, I mean, to our own giants on the platforms, though they are popular outside, but what about us? Isn't that? So our Raheja's diamonds are James, they are there. So I would like, yeah, thank you, ma'am, for giving and organizing such lecture series or lectures, and for asking me to give vote of thanks. So due to this, I was very alert throughout the lectures. I could get, that's what. So that was the significance since an vote of thanks should be at last. So due to that, I was alert throughout the lecture and I could understand the content more. That's what. Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ram. Please don't log off. Mansi, if you could please put up the feedback link also on the chat box. Staff members, please fill the feedback form. And Mansi, are you there? Mansi? Hello, Mansi?
Hello. Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes,
Mansi,
ma'am.
if you can please put up the feedback link, and I request all of you to switch on your cameras if possible for a couple of minutes so that we can have the group photograph as well with our dignitaries. I have Ram and Preeti here. Yes. Please fill the feedback
Ma'am, the
box.
feedback link is also posted on the Raisa group
Yes.
as well as on the chat box.
Thank you, Mansi. I request all of you to please switch on your camera. Mansi, you too in the frame. Yes, and if we could
Yes,
have,
yes.
please keep your cameras on for a couple of minutes because it takes some time till we click the pictures. Mansi, tell us when we should stop smiling and switch off the cameras.
Ma'am, actually, you should never stop smiling.
Yes, yeah, that is true. That is existence. Preeti, we are already learning a lot.
Yeah.
And Ram can say that he was alert. It's an indication that yes, we
Yeah.
are, we are in the crowd, not just individuals also. So I think we are learning a lot through the lecture.
Thanks, thanks.
Okay. So y'all can stop posing for the photographs. That is done. But always keep smiling.
Yes, thank you, Mansi. Thank you, Preeti, and thank you all the staff members for your presence today. Just one small announcement that we are going to have our next session on Thursday, 21st. The notice will be circulated soon. It's an offline lecture in